Should relegation be called from the WSL? Now, this has been an interesting topic in the last few weeks, as news has spread that relegation may be called in the WSL in order for investors to buy into the league. Now, this has caused friction among some fans, with some saying that relegation is the bedrock of which English football thrives on. Okay, that may be true for the men's game, but is it true for the women's game? I'm not sure. I mean, we must remember that women's football is a much smaller field than men's football. So the way I see it, I don't think that having relegation is good for women's football maybe in the short term, but definitely I think looking towards women's football in the long term, I believe that relegation may be a good thing, but just not in the short term. I mean, if we look at the WSL since 2011, in the first few seasons, that's never had relegation up until 2014, where Everton became the first recipients of relegation. Since then, we've seen a handful of teams get relegated, including the likes of Birmingham City, who are looking to win promotion back to the top flight, and the likes of Bristol City, who have been relegated twice, I think. But what are the pros and cons of removing relegation? Well, looking at it from an investing point of view, investors would want to buy into women's football more if there was no relegation, because I don't think investors would want to buy into a small league, well, not a small league, a big league that has relegation in the women's game. Okay, they'll want to buy into the Premier League because of the name that the Premier League has made for itself over the last 30 years. But in the women's game, like I said earlier, it's a smaller field where investors may be put off by relegation. So that may be a pro. But what about the cons of removing relegation? Well, we've seen in the WSL that relegation may mean that investors won't buy into a club. Like, if you see the likes of Birmingham City getting relegated or Bristol City getting relegated, investors may only want to buy into top flight teams, which is helpful for the WSL, but not so much for the Women's Championship. Sticking with relegation, I've been thinking about the way relegation is. Like, currently, it's one goes down and another one comes up. But I believe that lacks excitement, any real excitement. Like, what I'd like to see is a relegation system that's similar to the Scottish leagues, where 11th plays off against the sides from the Championship. For instance, imagine if 11th plays off against 2nd, 3rd, and 4th for the right to remain in the division. Or imagine if both 11th and 12th went down, and then the second promotion spot is challenged by teams that are finishing 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th. So like how it is similar in the EFL. Well, that for me, that's something I'd like to see, rather than the current system, which is one up, one down. But what are your thoughts? Now, I've heard from some fans that relegation is a necessity in women's football as that aids competition, and it may well do. But if you look at Premiership rugby, that hasn't had relegation for quite some time now, and honestly, I'm not too sure why the Premiership doesn't have relegation. So rugby fans, you can comment about that in the comments. But for me, looking at rugby, and not just the Premiership rugby, but the URC, which is the United Rugby Championship, and the Six Nations, the latter of which has been having debates about whether to instate relegation. I mean, currently, those three leagues have never had relegation, but rather they do something called expansion, which I believe is interesting. Well, not the Premiership, but the Six Nations, which expanded from 5 to 6 in 2000, and the URC, which expanded from the original 12 teams from Pro 12 to 14 for a few years, and for the last few years to 16 teams, and that. And looking at those rugby leagues not having relegation, I mean, the competition is great for it. Like, I don't believe that every European league needs relegation in order to be successful. Like, just look at the rugby leagues I've mentioned, and they've never had relegation, and they're doing quite well. So I don't believe that relegation is necessarily a necessity. I get why it's important, but if we're looking at the short term in women's football, I don't think that relegation is a good idea, especially if investors want to buy into women's football. Now, what I've just said there, I may get it in the neck from some fans, and maybe rightly so, but looking at it, I understand that you guys don't want an American franchise system where there is no relegation, but it's about being different. Like I remember times where I used to follow women's football when I was younger. Like, women's football was completely different to what men's football was. Like, for instance, Everton were winning trophies. Like, they won the League Cup in 2008 and the FA Cup in 2010. Like, who's ever seen Everton win a trophy in the men's game? You'd have to go back 30 years for the last time that's happened. And Birmingham City in the semi-finals of European competition in 2014. When has Birmingham City men's team ever been in European competition? Okay, that was recent as the 2011-12 season, but that was because they won the League Cup in 2011 rather than qualifying through league position, as what the Birmingham City women did. But I digress. But the point is that women's football shouldn't be what men's football is. Like, women's football can have its own identity, just as it does in the US, where if you look at the NWSL, you have women's teams that have their own names. Like, we have Orlando Pride, we have Kansas City Current, like Utah Royals, those sorts of teams. We don't have like an LA Galaxy woman or a Seattle Sounders woman or a Columbus Crew woman. Like, you know what I mean? But I really have digressed, haven't I? But yeah, women's football needs their own identity. And if that means scrapping relegation, then so be it. Yeah, so those are just my 2 cents on whether women's football should scrap relegation. But I'd like to know what you think, because for the way I think about it, like, if women's football is to have its own identity, it shouldn't be everything that men's football is. Like, women's football can be its own thing. Like I mentioned in the video, like, just have a quick look at the NWSL. Like, but those are just my 2 cents. But I'd like to know what you think. Should relegation be scrapped from the WSL? If so, why? If not, why? And what will be the benefits, if any, if relegation is scrapped from the WSL? I'd like to know what you think.